My name is Tazana Miller. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I believed my life was the kind most people would describe as stable. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. I live in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon. I work as a project coordinator for a regional architecture firm, a job that mostly involves keeping complicated things from falling apart. Deadlines, budgets, meetings, personalities. I've always been good at that sort of work. I notice details other people overlook, and I tend to stay calm when everyone else gets overwhelmed. People usually describe me as easygoing. Sometimes they mean it as a compliment. Other times, it's a polite way of saying they assume I won't cause problems. I've always been the kind of person others underestimate, not in an obvious way. No one ever says it out loud. But it shows up in small assumptions. The belief that I'll adapt, that I'll understand, that I'll quietly adjust myself so everyone else can remain comfortable. For most of my life, I didn't mind that role. It felt practical. But the story I'm about to tell you began on a Tuesday evening about 18 months ago, when my husband came home and casually mentioned that his best friend needed a place to stay for a little while. At the time, it sounded like a simple favor. Friends helping friends. Temporary. Harmless. That's what I thought too. And to be fair, nothing about the situation looked suspicious in the beginning. His friend had just gone through a rough breakup. He needed somewhere stable for a few weeks while he figured things out. We had a spare room. My husband promised it wouldn't be long. If you had asked me that night how I felt about it, I would have told you the truth. I didn't think it mattered very much. But over the weeks that followed, small details started appearing, the kind of details most people might ignore. A comment that didn't quite line up with an earlier story. A moment of hesitation when I asked a harmless question. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. None of it is dramatic. Nothing that would justify an argument, but enough to create a quiet, persistent feeling that something about the situation in our home wasn't what I had been told. And the strange part is, the deeper truth didn't reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a puzzle where the pieces only make sense after you've been holding them for a while. By the time I finally understood why my husband had invited his best friend into our house without explaining the real reason, the situation had already changed our marriage in ways none of us could easily undo. This isn't a story about shouting, revenge, or dramatic confrontations. It's about observation, about patience, and about the quiet moment when you realize that the role people assumed you would play was never actually yours. So, before we begin, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment when you realized that the story you were being told wasn't the whole truth? If you asked my husband a year ago to describe me to someone, he probably would have said something like this. Tazana's the calm one, not the funny one, not the ambitious one, not the complicated one, just the calm one. And in fairness, that description wasn't wrong. I've always been the kind of person who prefers observation over reaction. In meetings at work, I'm the one quietly taking notes while other people debate. In family gatherings, I'm the one refilling glasses and listening to conversations instead of steering them. Most people interpret that as being easy to live with. What they don't realize is that quiet people usually see more, not less. My husband Daniel and I had been married for 8 years when this story started. We met in our mid-20s through mutual friends, back when life still felt like something you could plan neatly on a calendar. Daniel was the kind of person who filled a room without trying. Confident, quick with jokes, the person everyone gravitated toward during parties. Where I preferred structure and quiet evenings, he thrived on spontaneity. For a long time, that difference worked in our favor. He pulled me into social circles I never would have entered on my own. I gave him a place that felt stable when everything else in his life moved quickly. At least, that's how I thought of it. Daniel's closest friend, Marcus, had been part of his life long before I arrived. They met in college and stayed connected through everything that followed. Jobs, breakups, moves, late-night phone calls about things that seemed urgent at the time. Marcus was the kind of friend who could show up unannounced and still be welcomed like family, which is why, when Daniel mentioned him that Tuesday evening, I didn't hesitate. We were standing in the kitchen while I finished rinsing dishes. Daniel leaned against the counter, scrolling through something on his phone. Marcus might need a place to stay for a bit, he said casually. The way people mention things, they've already half decided. I remember drying my hands and asking the obvious question. For how long? He shrugged. A couple of weeks, maybe. His situation with Claire blew up worse than he expected. I had met Claire twice. Both times, she seemed perfectly pleasant, but relationships have their own internal weather systems. Outsiders rarely understand the storms. A couple of weeks is fine, I said. And I meant it. We had a guest room that was mostly being used to store boxes from a move we had completed nearly 2 years earlier. It wasn't exactly a sacrifice to clear some space. Daniel smiled in that quick, grateful way people do when things go easier than expected. Thanks, Taz. I knew you'd understand. That phrase, I knew you'd understand, was something I heard often in our marriage. At the time, it sounded like appreciation. Later, I realized it sometimes meant something else. Marcus moved in 3 days later with 2 duffel bags, a laptop backpack, and the kind of awkward politeness people carry when they know they're temporarily occupying someone else's life. The first week passed exactly the way everyone expected it to. Marcus stayed mostly in the guest room during the day, working remotely. Daniel and I went to our jobs like normal. In the evenings, we sometimes ate dinner together, talking about small things. Work frustrations, the absurdity of Portland traffic, the strange weather patterns that made winter feel longer every year. Nothing about the arrangement seemed unusual. If anything, Marcus tried almost too hard to be considerate. He washed his own dishes immediately. He bought groceries without being asked. Once, he even replaced a light bulb in the hallway before I noticed it had burned out. From the outside, it probably looked like a perfectly reasonable situation. But if you had watched closely during those early days, you might have noticed something about the way conversations moved when I entered the room. Not dramatically, just slightly. Marcus and Daniel would be talking quietly in the living room, their voices low and serious. The moment I walked in, the tone shifted. Suddenly, the conversation became lighter. Jokes, sports, something forgettable. At first, I told myself it was natural. Friends sometimes have private conversations. But there was another detail I couldn't quite ignore. Marcus never once mentioned when he planned to leave. And Daniel never brought it up either. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing most people would probably overlook. But I wrote it down in my notebook that night anyway. Not because I suspected anything. Just because I've always believed that the smallest details often become the most important ones later. And at the time, I still thought I was just being careful. I didn't yet realize that I was quietly documenting the beginning of something much more complicated. Looking back, the first moment that unsettled me wasn't dramatic at all. There was no argument, no raised voices, no obvious sign that anything was wrong. It happened on a Sunday morning, about 10 days after Marcus moved in. Sunday mornings in our house had always followed the same quiet rhythm. Daniel slept later than I did, so I usually woke up first, made coffee, and spent an hour reading or planning my week in the small leather notebook I carried everywhere. That morning was no different. The house was still quiet when I walked into the kitchen. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, very typical for Portland, and the soft sound of someone moving around in the guest room told me Marcus was already awake. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the dining table with my notebook. A few minutes later, Marcus walked in. "Morning," he said. He looked slightly embarrassed, the way guests sometimes do when they're trying not to feel like they're intruding. "Morning," I replied. "Coffee?" "Please." He poured himself a cup and sat across from me. For a while, we just listened to the rain and talked about ordinary things. How remote work made weekends feel less distinct. How strange it was adjusting to someone else's house. Nothing uncomfortable. If anything, it felt normal. Then Daniel walked in. His hair was messy, his t-shirt wrinkled from sleep, and he gave Marcus that quick nod men sometimes use instead of a full greeting. "Morning." "Morning," Marcus said. Daniel opened the refrigerator and stared inside for a moment. "You make eggs?" he asked, glancing toward me. I closed my notebook. "Sure." Cooking breakfast together wasn't unusual, but before I could stand up, Marcus leaned back in his chair and said something that changed the atmosphere in the room in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. "Actually, man," Marcus said casually, "remember what we talked about yesterday? Might be better if we just grab something out later." Daniel paused. For a moment, just a moment, he looked at Marcus in a way I couldn't quite read. Then he closed the refrigerator door. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Good point." I stayed seated, my hands still resting on the notebook. "Did I miss something?" I asked. Daniel smiled, but it was the kind of smile people use when they're trying to move a conversation forward without explaining it. "Nothing important," he said. "Marcus and I were just talking about maybe going out later." That answer should have been perfectly reasonable, but something about the way Marcus looked down at his coffee and the way Daniel immediately changed the subject afterward left a small, quiet gap in the room. Not a lie, just a missing piece. "Anyway," Daniel said, grabbing his phone from the counter, "there's a new breakfast place Marcus wants to try." Marcus nodded quickly. "Yeah, heard it's good." I watched them both for a second. Then I opened my notebook again. "Sounds fun," I said. And that was the end of the conversation. An outside observer would have seen nothing unusual. 3 adults are discussing breakfast plans on a rainy morning. But after years of coordinating complicated projects at work, I had developed a habit of noticing when information was being redirected instead of answered. It wasn't the suggestion to go out that bothered me. It was the sentence Marcus had said before that. "Remember what we talked about yesterday." The words themselves weren't suspicious, but the timing of them was. Because the night before, Daniel and Marcus had spent nearly 2 hours in the garage talking while I worked on a deadline in the living room. And when Daniel came back inside, I asked him what they were discussing. He had shrugged and said, "Just catching up." "Sit at ease." At the time, I believed him. Now, sitting at the table with my coffee cooling beside me, I realized something simple. There had been another conversation. One that apparently involved me, but not with me. It wasn't enough to confront anyone about it, not even close. It was just a small moment, a small cut, the kind that most people would ignore. But I wrote it down in my notebook anyway. Because over time, I've learned something about small cuts. One by itself means very little, but when you start to see a pattern, that's when the real story begins to reveal itself. And at that point, I still believed I was just being observant. I didn't yet realize that the pattern had already begun. One of the strangest things about subtle changes in a household is how quickly they begin to feel normal. Not because they truly are normal, but human beings are remarkably good at adjusting to small discomforts when they happen slowly. After that Sunday morning, life in our house continued much the same as before. Daniel left for work early most days. Marcus stayed in the guest room with his laptop. I managed deadlines and meetings at the architecture firm. On the surface, nothing about the arrangement seemed to demand concern, but the quiet gaps in conversations kept appearing. Not every day, just often enough to notice. One evening, about 2 weeks later, I came home from work earlier than usual. A client meeting had been canceled, so I stopped by the grocery store and picked up a few things for dinner. When I walked into the house, I heard Daniel and Marcus talking in the living room. Their voices were low, serious. "I'm just saying the timing matters," Marcus was saying. Daniel responded quickly, his voice tight. "I know, but it's not like I can just..." The sentence stopped the moment I stepped into the doorway. Both of them looked up. The shift was immediate. Marcus leaned back on the couch. Daniel cleared his throat. "Hey," he said. "You're home early." I held up the grocery bag. Meeting got canceled. For a second, none of us said anything. Then Marcus smiled in that slightly forced way people do when they're suddenly aware they've been overheard. "Smells like you bought something good." "Just pasta," I said. Daniel stood up. "I'll help you with that." In the kitchen, he started unpacking groceries while I filled a pot with water. After a moment, I asked the question that seemed obvious. "What were you guys talking about?" Daniel didn't look up from the counter. "Nothing important." The exact same phrase he had used the previous week. I waited. Sometimes people add details if you leave a little silence in the air. He didn't. Instead, he picked up a tomato and said, "You want me to chop these?" I nodded. "Sure." And just like that, the conversation moved on. At the time, I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Marcus didn't want to talk about his breakup in front of me. Maybe they were discussing something personal between friends. Maybe I was simply overthinking. That's the thing about quiet discomfort. You start negotiating with yourself. You create explanations that preserve harmony. Because the alternative, confrontation, feels unnecessary when the evidence is still small. So I stayed quiet, not out of weakness, out of practicality. But something else began happening during those weeks. Marcus stopped referring to the guest room as temporary. At first, he had said things like, "Once I find a new place," until things settle down. But gradually, those phrases disappeared. Instead, he talked about small adjustments to the room. One evening, he asked Daniel if he could move the desk closer to the window. Another day, he mentioned ordering a new office chair. None of those things was unreasonable on their own. But when you place them together, they suggest a different timeline, a longer one. The strange part was that Daniel never corrected him. He never said, "That's fine for now, but remember you'll be leaving soon." He simply nodded, or said, "Yeah, do whatever makes you comfortable." I noticed it, but I didn't mention it, because by then, a quiet role had already started forming around me in that house. The reasonable one, the accommodating one, the person who didn't make small things into big problems. And once people begin to expect that version of you, it becomes surprisingly easy for them to continue making decisions around you instead of with you. One night, while Daniel was in the shower, I opened my notebook and reviewed the small entries I had written over the past 2 weeks. They looked almost insignificant on the page. Short observations, fragments of conversations, moments when explanations had quietly shifted direction. None of it proved anything. But together, they created a feeling I couldn't ignore. A pattern was beginning to form. And the most unsettling part wasn't what Daniel and Marcus were saying. It was what they seemed to assume about me. They assumed I wouldn't notice. Or if I did notice, they assumed I wouldn't say anything. At that point, they were still right. But that assumption was about to become the most serious mistake anyone in that house would make. There's a quiet moment in many relationships when you realize something important. Not about love, not about loyalty, but about roles. Every household, every friendship, every workplace. People unconsciously assign roles to each other. Someone becomes the organizer. Someone becomes the entertainer. Someone becomes the decision maker. And sometimes, without ever discussing it, someone becomes the person who simply adapts. For years, that had been my role in our home, not in a dramatic or unfair way. Daniel wasn't controlling, and I had never felt ignored in any obvious sense. But gradually, over time, a pattern had formed. Daniel made spontaneous decisions, and I made them work. If he invited friends over at the last minute, I adjusted dinner plans. If he changed travel dates, I rearranged schedules. If something unexpected happened, I quietly stepped in to stabilize things. At first, I didn't mind that role. I was good at it. But Marcus living with us brought that dynamic into sharper focus than I had ever seen before. Because the longer he stayed, the more obvious it became that decisions about the house were happening between Daniel and Marcus first, and then simply being absorbed by me afterward. One evening, about 3 weeks after Marcus moved in, I came home to find a new television mounted on the living room wall. It was larger than the one we had before. Noticeably larger. Marcus and Daniel were standing in front of it like two engineers admiring a finished project. Daniel turned when he saw me. "Oh, hey," he said, smiling. "What do you think?" I set my bag down slowly. "When did this happen?" "Today," Marcus said. "Daniel found a great deal online." Daniel nodded. The old one was starting to glitch anyway. That part wasn't entirely wrong. The previous TV had frozen once or twice, but the decision had clearly already been made. The installation had already happened. My opinion was being requested after the fact. I looked at the screen for a moment. "It's big." Marcus laughed. "Right? Makes movie nights way better." Daniel studied my expression. "You don't like it?" I considered the question carefully. It wasn't really about the television. It was about the process. But explaining that in the moment would have turned something small into something complicated. So I said the sentence that people in my position often say, "It's fine." "Imosi nai shine." And everyone relaxed. Marcus grabbed the remote. Daniel opened a beer. The evening continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But later that night, while brushing my teeth, I looked at our reflection in the bathroom mirror. Daniel stood behind me, scrolling through his phone, completely comfortable. Not defensive, not guilty, just certain. Certain that whatever decisions had been made that day were acceptable. Because in his mind, they probably were. That was the moment something subtle shifted in my understanding. Daniel and Marcus hadn't deliberately excluded me. Not consciously. They had simply begun treating me as someone who would accommodate the outcome. Someone whose role was to smooth over changes rather than shape them. Reliable. Helpful. Invisible. And the truth is, for a long time, I had allowed that identity to exist without questioning it. Because peace can be easier than correction. But once you notice the role people have assigned you, you start seeing it everywhere. In the meantime, Marcus now left small items around the house as he belonged there. In the way Daniel discussed plans with him first. In the meantime, neither of them ever mentioned when Marcus might leave anymore. None of it was openly disrespectful, but the underlying message was becoming clearer. The house was adapting around Marcus, and I was expected to adapt to it. That night, before turning off the bedside lamp, I opened my leather notebook again. I didn't write anything dramatic. Just one sentence. Roles only exist as long as someone agrees to keep playing them. At the time, I didn't yet know what role I would eventually choose for myself. But I had begun to realize something important. The one everyone assumed I would continue playing was no longer the one I intended to keep. The moment things shifted didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no dramatic discovery. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while I was sitting alone in my car. I had just left work early after a long meeting with one of our senior architects. My head was full of project details, zoning permits, material costs, deadlines that always seemed to arrive faster than expected. Normally, I would have driven straight home, but instead, I sat in the parking lot with the engine off, watching people walk past with their laptops and coffee cups, all moving through the quiet routines of their lives. And for some reason, I kept thinking about the past few weeks. Marcus's desk is moving closer to the window. The television appears on the wall. Conversations that changed direction the moment I walked into the room. Individually, each moment had been small, but together they had created a strange, persistent feeling. Not anger, not even resentment, just clarity slowly forming. Up until that point, I had been reacting to the situation the way most people do. I had been trying to interpret it emotionally. Was Daniel being inconsiderate? Was Marcus overstaying his welcome? Was I overthinking everything? But sitting there in the quiet of that parking lot, something in my thinking changed. Instead of asking how I felt, I started asking a different question. What is actually happening here? It's a small shift in perspective, but it changes everything. Because when you stop interpreting situations emotionally and start observing them structurally, patterns become much easier to see. And the pattern in my house had become obvious. Daniel had made a decision before discussing it with me. Marcus had been invited into a space that was supposed to belong to both of us. And over time, the situation had quietly expanded without any clear endpoint. No timeline, no boundaries, no honest explanation for why things were unfolding this way. But the most important realization wasn't about them, it was about me. For weeks, I had been waiting for a conversation that might never happen. Waiting for Daniel to volunteer the full story. Waiting for Marcus to clarify his plans. Waiting for circumstances to naturally resolve themselves. And suddenly, I understood something simple. Waiting was a choice, a role I had unconsciously continued playing. In that moment, sitting in the quiet parking lot, I made a decision that felt surprisingly calm. I wasn't going to confront anyone. Not yet. Instead, I was going to do the one thing I had always been very good at. Observe. Carefully, systematically, without emotion clouding the process. Because if there was more to the situation than I had been told, and by then I strongly suspected there was, then the truth would eventually appear in the details. People reveal their real motivations over time, through schedules, through financial decisions, through small slips in conversation. All you have to do is pay attention. When I finally started the car and drove home, nothing about the house looked different from the outside. The same front porch, the same maple tree in the yard, the same warm light is coming through the living room window. Inside, Daniel and Marcus were sitting on the couch watching something loud and forgettable on the new television. Marcus looked up when I walked in. "Hey, Taz." Daniel smiled. "You're home early again." I set my bag down by the door. "Yeah, long meeting." Then I walked into the kitchen and began preparing dinner. I didn't ask what they had been discussing. I didn't mention the things I had been noticing. I didn't challenge a single detail. And that, more than anything, seemed to reassure them. From their perspective, nothing had changed. I was still the same calm, reasonable person who had welcomed Marcus into the house without hesitation. Still the same woman who avoided unnecessary conflict. Still the same wife who seemed perfectly comfortable with the way things were unfolding. They had no way of knowing that something inside me had quietly shifted that afternoon. Because sometimes the most important decisions a person makes are completely invisible to everyone else. And that was the day I stopped waiting for answers. From that point forward, I intended to find them. After that Thursday afternoon, something subtle changed in the way I moved through my own home. Not outwardly. To Daniel and Marcus, everything probably looked exactly the same. I still came home from work, made dinner most evenings, and asked polite questions about their days. I still laughed at Marcus's occasional jokes and listened when Daniel talked about work frustrations. From the outside, nothing about my behavior suggested tension. But internally, my silence had changed its meaning. Before, it had been a reflex, a way to maintain peace while I sorted out my thoughts. Now, it was a decision. And decisions come with intention. The first thing I noticed once I shifted into observation mode was how comfortable both men had become with the routine of the house. Marcus had stopped behaving like a temporary guest. He moved through the kitchen easily now, opening cabinets without hesitation. His shoes appeared beside Daniel's near the front door. His laptop sometimes sat open on the dining table long after he had stepped away. Small signs of someone settling in. The second thing I noticed was Daniel's growing habit of consulting Marcus about things before mentioning them to me. One evening, I overheard them discussing weekend plans in the living room. "Saturday would work better," Marcus said. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, that's probably easier." When I stepped into the room a moment later, Daniel turned toward me. "Oh, by the way," he said casually, "Marcus and I might head out Saturday morning to help a friend move." The phrasing caught my attention. Marcus and I. Not we, the way couples often describe plans. I simply nodded. "Okay." He seemed relieved by the lack of questions. Another evening, I came downstairs late at night for a glass of water and noticed the soft glow of light under the guest room door. Marcus was inside talking quietly on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but one sentence drifted clearly through the hallway. "No, it's working for now." A pause. "Yeah, Daniel said we'll figure the rest out soon." "We'll figure the rest out." "No, I'll figure it out." Again, it wasn't proof of anything, just another detail. I added it to the notebook the next morning. By that point, writing things down had become almost automatic. I didn't record every moment, only the ones that felt slightly misaligned with the explanation I had originally been given. And the explanation had been simple. Marcus needed a temporary place to stay after a breakup. But temporary arrangements usually come with certain characteristics. A rough timeline, active searching for a new place, occasional conversations about moving forward. None of those things seemed to be happening. Instead, the situation was slowly solidifying into something more permanent. The strange part was that neither Daniel nor Marcus appeared worried about my reaction to that shift. They spoke freely in front of me. They made small household decisions together. They discussed plans that extended weeks into the future, all with the quiet assumption that I would simply continue adjusting. And for the moment, I did. Not because I accepted the situation, because observation requires patience. A week later, I found another small piece of information entirely by accident. I was sitting at the kitchen counter one evening, paying bills on my laptop while Daniel showered upstairs. Marcus had stepped out to pick up takeout. When my bank app refreshed, I noticed a new shared expense on our household credit card. It wasn't a large purchase, just a furniture store charge. But the item description caught my eye. Ergonomic office chair. Delivery. Scheduled delivery address. Our home. I closed the laptop slowly. Marcus had mentioned ordering a new chair once. At the time, I assumed it was a casual idea. Apparently, it had already been decided. And once again, the decision had happened without a conversation. I didn't mention it when Daniel came downstairs. Instead, I asked him a simple question while we unpacked the takeout containers later that night. "Marcus, enjoying working from the guest room?" Daniel shrugged. "Yeah, seems like it." Another neutral answer. Another missing detail. Another quiet entry for the notebook. By then, my silence had begun to feel almost strategic. Because the more relaxed Daniel and Marcus became around me, the more naturally they revealed pieces of the situation they thought I wasn't paying attention to. And the truth is, they were right about one thing. I wasn't reacting. Not yet. But silence, when chosen deliberately, has a strange power. It gives other people the space to show you exactly who they believe you are. And more importantly, exactly what they think they can get away with. By the time Marcus's new office chair arrived, the house had settled into a rhythm that looked completely ordinary from the outside. 3 adults sharing a space. 3 separate schedules. 3 sets of routines that occasionally overlap during dinner or late-night television. If you had visited us then, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. But what Daniel and Marcus never realized was that while the situation felt comfortable to them, I had quietly begun preparing for something else entirely. Not confrontation. Preparation. At work, my job required me to track dozens of moving parts across multiple projects. Contractors, architects, clients, budgets, permits. If something went wrong, it was usually because someone had missed a detail weeks earlier. So I approached my own situation the same way. I paid attention to timelines. Marcus had originally arrived with 2 duffel bags. Within a month, that had expanded to a new office chair, additional clothes, a desk lamp, and several packages delivered to the house under his name. Temporary guests usually travel light. Settling residents accumulate objects. I wrote the dates of each delivery in my notebook. Then I started noticing financial patterns. Marcus occasionally offered to buy groceries, but the larger household expenses still ran through the account Daniel and I shared. Utility bills increased slightly with the extra person in the house. Nothing dramatic, just measurable. And yet, Daniel had never once mentioned adjusting the arrangement to account for it. That absence was interesting, because Daniel wasn't careless with money, which meant the oversight wasn't accidental. Then there were conversations. Most people assume that if someone stays quiet during discussions, they're not paying close attention. The opposite is usually true. One evening, while the 3 of us were eating dinner, Marcus casually mentioned something that made me pause. "My company might extend remote work another 6 months," he said, twirling pasta on his fork. Daniel looked up immediately. "That'd be great for you." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, makes things easier while I get everything sorted." Daniel smiled. "You've got time, Daniel." The sentence floated across the table as it belonged there. You've got time. Neither of them noticed the way I briefly stopped eating, because time in this situation had never been discussed with me. Another evening, I overheard them in the garage again. The door was partially open while I watered plants in the backyard. Marcus's voice drifted through the gap. "I just don't want this to blow up later." Daniel replied quickly. "It won't. Taz is reasonable." There was a small pause. Then Marcus said something I'll never forget. "Yeah, she seems like the type who just rolls with things." I finished watering the plants and went back inside. Not angry, not hurt, just enlightened. Because in that moment, I finally understood the full picture of the role they believed I played in this situation. To them, I was stability, predictability, the person who absorbed change without resistance, the person who would prioritize harmony over confrontation. And in fairness, my past behavior had supported that assumption. But what they didn't know was that while they were growing more comfortable, I had quietly started organizing information in a way they would never expect. The notebook had expanded from casual observations into structured entries. Dates, expenses, conversations, changes in the house, patterns in Daniel's behavior. Not because I was building a case against anyone, but clarity requires context, and context requires records. One night after both men had gone to bed, I sat at the dining table reviewing everything I had written over the past 6 weeks. When you see small details on separate days, they seem insignificant. But when you place them all together, a very clear shape begins to form. Marcus's stay had no timeline. Daniel was actively reassuring him that the arrangement would continue, and both of them believed I would accept that reality without challenge. That belief had become the foundation of their comfort. And that was the one thing they never noticed. Because preparation doesn't make noise. It happens quietly. In notebooks. In late-night reflections. In the careful gathering of facts before any decision is made. By the time I closed the notebook that night, I wasn't confused anymore. I understood the structure of the situation. What I didn't yet know was why it had started in the first place. But the answer to that question was closer than I realized. And when it finally revealed itself, it would change everything. The truth didn't arrive through a dramatic confession. There was no moment when someone sat me down and explained everything. Like most important realizations, it appeared quietly, hidden inside something ordinary. It was a Tuesday evening, nearly 2 months after Marcus had moved into the house. Daniel had left earlier that morning for an overnight work trip in Seattle. Marcus was still home, working from the guest room like usual. I had come back from work later than normal, carrying a stack of project folders I needed to review before the next day's meeting. The house was quiet when I walked in. Marcus called out from the guest room. "Hey, Taz." "Hey. You want Thai tonight?" I was thinking of ordering. "Sure," I said, setting my bag down. "That sounds good." We had dinner at the kitchen table about an hour later. It was an easy, relaxed conversation, the kind you have when two people share a space but not necessarily a deep connection. Work frustrations, the strange Portland weather, a new coffee shop had opened down the street. Nothing important. After we finished eating, Marcus cleared the plates while I wiped the table. It was the kind of routine that had become strangely normal over the past weeks. Then his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen quickly. And for the briefest moment, something in his expression changed. It wasn't panic, more like hesitation. He picked up the phone and stepped toward the hallway. "I'm gonna take this," he said. "Of course." I turned back to my folders and began organizing papers on the dining table. A minute passed, then 2. Marcus was speaking quietly in the guest room with the door partially closed. I wasn't trying to listen, but the house carried sound easily at night. A few words drifted into the hallway. "No, she doesn't know." "Mas tomoso." A pause. "I told you. Daniel said it's better this way for now." My hand stopped moving across the papers. I hadn't expected to hear my husband's name. The conversation continued, still quiet but slightly clearer now that I was listening. "Look, the situation with the lease is complicated." Another pause. "I'm not staying forever. We just needed somewhere stable while we figure it out." Then the sentence that quietly rearranged everything I thought I understood. "It's not just about me." "Maman." The words hung in the air long after Marcus ended the call. A few minutes later, he walked back into the kitchen like nothing unusual had happened. "Sorry," he said casually. "Work thing." I nodded. "No problem." But my mind had already begun rearranging the pieces of information I'd been collecting for weeks. Suddenly, several things made more sense. The vague timeline. Daniel reassured Marcus that he had time. The private conversations. And the fact that Marcus had said something very specific during that call. The situation with the lease is complicated. But Daniel and I owned our house. There was no lease here, which meant Marcus was talking about another place. And more importantly, another situation. One that apparently involved Daniel helping him in ways I hadn't been told about. That night, after Marcus went to bed, I opened my notebook again. But instead of writing observations, I started asking questions. Simple ones. If Marcus had a complicated lease situation, what exactly had happened with his apartment? If Daniel already knew about it, why hadn't he explained the full story to me? And why had Marcus said, "It's not just about me"? The more I examined those questions, the clearer one possibility became. Marcus wasn't just staying with us because of a breakup. There was another reason. Something larger. Something Daniel believed was easier to manage without my involvement. I didn't feel angry when I reached that conclusion. Just calm. Because for the first time, the shape of the hidden story was beginning to emerge. And with it came a new realization. If Daniel had deliberately chosen not to tell me the full reason Marcus was living in our house, then the real explanation probably wasn't something small. It was something he believed might change the way I saw the situation entirely. But the most interesting part wasn't what I had learned that night. It was the fact that Marcus had assumed I wasn't paying attention. That assumption had made him comfortable. Comfortable enough to reveal a piece of the truth without realizing it. And once you discover the first piece of a hidden story, the rest of it usually isn't far behind. Once you begin to see the outline of a hidden situation, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do you do with that knowledge? For several days after overhearing Marcus's phone call, I didn't act on anything. I continued moving through the same routines as before. Work, dinner, quiet evenings in the living room. But internally, my thinking had shifted into a different mode. Instead of asking what was happening, I started considering what my options were. The first option was the most obvious one: confront Daniel. When he returned from Seattle, I could have asked direct questions. I could have mentioned the phone call. I could have told him everything I had been noticing over the past 2 months. In theory, that would have been the fastest way to get answers. But confrontation also comes with a cost. Once people know what you know, they immediately begin adjusting their behavior. They become careful with their words. Conversations stop happening openly. Information disappears. If Daniel and Marcus had already been managing the situation without telling me everything, a confrontation would likely push the remaining details further out of reach. So I set that option aside. The second option was more passive. Do nothing. Let the situation continue, and trust that eventually the truth will reveal itself naturally. But waiting without direction felt different now than it had before. At the beginning, I had been patient because I assumed the arrangement was temporary. Now I understand that patience alone wouldn't change the structure of the situation. Time, by itself, rarely solves problems that people are actively avoiding. Which left the third option. Quietly reposition myself, not emotionally, practically. That option required the most patience, but it also created the most control. Over the next week, I started taking small steps that had nothing to do with Marcus directly. First, I reviewed the financial structure of our household. Daniel and I shared several accounts: mortgage payments, utilities, and joint savings. But we also maintained separate personal accounts for our own expenses. The arrangement had always worked smoothly. Now I simply made sure I understood every detail of it. Then I scheduled a lunch meeting with a colleague who specialized in residential property contracts. Officially, we discussed zoning regulations for a project our firm was considering. Unofficially, I asked a few general questions about property ownership structures and legal responsibilities when additional residents stayed long-term in a home. The conversation was calm, professional, and entirely hypothetical. But the answers were useful. Next, I began organizing documents at home: mortgage statements, utility bills, insurance policies. Not because anything was wrong, but clarity is easier when everything is in order. Through all of this, Daniel and Marcus continued behaving exactly the way they had before: comfortable, relaxed, occasionally discussing things in low voices when they thought I wasn't listening. From their perspective, the situation remained stable. And that stability allowed me to observe one final detail that helped complete the picture. One evening, Marcus mentioned something while we were all watching television. "Claire finally signed the lease termination papers," he said. Daniel glanced at him. "That's good." Marcus nodded. "Yeah. Now I just need to sort out the rest of the mess." Daniel gave him a reassuring look. "You've got support here." Marcus smiled. "Thanks, man." I didn't say anything, but internally, something clicked into place. Marcus's apartment situation had clearly been more complicated than a simple breakup. Lease termination papers suggested legal and financial entanglements, which meant Daniel had likely been helping him manage those complications, possibly for weeks before Marcus moved in. And if that was true, then the decision to bring Marcus into our home had never actually been a spontaneous favor. It had been a plan. One that had simply been presented to me as something smaller. That realization didn't make me angry. It made my next decision very clear. if a plan had been made without including me, then I would quietly create my own. Not to punish anyone, not to escalate conflict, but to ensure that whatever happened next, I would no longer be the person reacting to decisions after they were already made. Because roles only continue when the person playing them agrees to stay in position. And by that point, I had already chosen a different role for myself. One that neither Daniel nor Marcus had noticed yet, but they would, soon enough. Once I made the decision to reposition myself, the most important rule I followed was simple. Nothing I did would attract attention. Not from Daniel, not from Marcus, not even from the routines of the house itself. Because once people notice change, they begin asking questions. And questions tend to close the very windows you need open. So everything I did looked ordinary. The first step was financial clarity. Late one evening after dinner, I sat at the dining table with my laptop, the same way I had many nights before. Daniel and Marcus were in the living room watching a basketball game, arguing casually about which team had the better defense. From their perspective, I was simply reviewing work emails. In reality, I was reorganizing something small but meaningful. Over the years, Daniel and I had allowed a large portion of our shared savings to remain in the joint account tied to our mortgage and utilities. It had never been an issue. We trusted each other. But trust and structure are two different things. Quietly, over the course of several days, I redistributed some of my personal contributions back into my individual account. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to ensure that my financial independence was clear and protected if circumstances ever required it. Nothing about the household bills changed. Mortgage payments continued exactly as before. Daniel never noticed. The second step involved information. One afternoon during lunch break, I scheduled a brief consultation with a legal advisor who occasionally worked with our architecture firm on property development contracts. The conversation was entirely professional. I asked about general homeowner rights when additional occupants stay in a property long-term without formal agreements, hypothetical questions, general scenarios. But the answers confirmed something I had suspected. Without a written agreement or formal tenant status, Marcus was technically still a guest in the home. A long-term guest, perhaps, but a guest nonetheless. That detail mattered, not because I intended to use it immediately, because understanding the structure of a situation gives you options. And options are what quiet control is built on. Meanwhile, life inside the house continued normally. Marcus's office chair had arrived and now sat neatly by the guest room window. Daniel occasionally mentioned work frustrations at dinner. We watched movies on the oversized television they had installed together. From the outside, our household looked calm, comfortable even. But the third step I took was the one that mattered most. Observation turned into documentation. My notebook had always contained small entries, dates, conversations, changes. Now I began organizing those notes more carefully. Timeline, financial impact, decisions made without discussion. Nothing dramatic, just facts. Because facts remove confusion. And once confusion disappears, decisions become easier. About 2 weeks into this quiet restructuring, something interesting happened. Daniel came home from work one evening looking unusually thoughtful. Marcus was cooking pasta in the kitchen. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing blueprints. Daniel set his bag down and said something that immediately caught my attention. Marcus and I were talking earlier today. Marcus glanced over from the stove. Yeah, Daniel continued. We might need a little more time to sort everything out with his situation. He said it casually, almost like a routine update. But it was the first time either of them had even vaguely acknowledged that the arrangement might extend longer than originally implied. I looked up from the blueprints. How much time? Marcus shrugged. Hard to say exactly. Daniel quickly added. But it shouldn't be a problem, right? The question hung in the air. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't defensive. It was simply confident. Confident that I would respond the way I always had, reasonably, accommodating, predictably. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I gave the same calm answer I had given many times before. We'll figure it out. Both men visibly relaxed. Marcus smiled and returned to stirring the pasta. Daniel nodded and grabbed a beer from the refrigerator. The conversation ended there. But internally, something important had just happened. For the first time, they had slightly extended the timeline of Marcus's stay out loud, which meant the situation was moving exactly where I had expected it to go. And the quiet preparations I had been making would soon become relevant. Not because I intended to start a fight, but because once the full truth surfaced, everyone in that house would realize that the one person they believed had been quietly adapting the entire time had actually been moving long before they noticed. The interesting thing about quiet decisions is that their consequences rarely arrive all at once. They appear gradually, like small shifts in gravity that people feel before they fully understand what has changed. For weeks after Daniel casually mentioned needing a little more time for Marcus's situation, the house continued operating the way it always had. Dinner conversations, late-night television, occasional weekends when Daniel and Marcus disappeared for a few hours to run errands. Nothing looked different, but beneath that routine, the structure of the situation had already begun to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to start creating small points of friction. The first one appeared in a place neither of them expected. Utilities. One evening, Daniel was reviewing our household expenses at the kitchen counter. It was something he did occasionally, more out of habit than concern. He scrolled through the numbers on his tablet and frowned slightly. "Electric bill's a little higher this month," he said. Marcus looked up from the couch. "Probably my fault. I've been running the heater in the guest room." Daniel shrugged. "It's fine." Then he glanced toward me. "We might need to rebalance a few things." His tone suggested the adjustment would be simple, routine. But this time, I didn't automatically absorb the change the way I normally would have. Instead, I asked a quiet question. "Rebalance how?" Daniel hesitated for a second. "Just adjusting the shared expenses a bit." Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable. "Honestly, I should probably start pitching in more," he said. The statement hung in the air. For the first time since he had moved in, the idea of Marcus contributing formally to the household had been spoken out loud. Daniel waved a hand casually. "We'll figure something out." But the conversation had already planted a seed. Because once financial structures enter the discussion, the arrangement stops feeling temporary. Guests don't renegotiate household costs. Residents do. The second shift happened about a week later. Marcus was sitting at the dining table working when his phone rang. He answered casually, assuming it was another routine call. But after a few minutes, his voice became noticeably tense. "Wait, what?" Daniel and I were both in the living room. Marcus stood up and walked toward the hallway, but the door to the guest room didn't fully close. "No, that wasn't the agreement," he said. A pause. "Daniel told me." He stopped mid-sentence when he noticed me walking past the hallway toward the kitchen. Our eyes met for a brief moment. He turned his back slightly and lowered his voice. The conversation ended quickly after that. When he returned to the living room, his expression had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest something outside the house had shifted. Daniel noticed immediately. "What's up?" Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Just more paperwork stuff with the lease termination." Daniel frowned. "I thought that was settled." "So did I." The two of them exchanged a glance. It was quick, almost silent, but it carried the weight of something unresolved. And for the first time since Marcus had moved in, I saw a small crack appear in the confidence they had both been carrying. Because whatever arrangement they had been managing outside the house was beginning to follow them inside. The third shift was even quieter. Daniel started asking me small questions he hadn't asked before. One evening, while we were getting ready for bed, he said, "You're okay with everything, right?" I looked up from the book I was reading. "With what?" "You know, Marcus is staying a little longer." His tone was careful now, less confident than before. I closed the book gently. "I said we'd figure it out." He studied my face for a moment, as if trying to read something that wasn't visible. Then he nodded. "Right." And that was the moment I understood something important. They were beginning to feel the edges of uncertainty. Not because I had confronted them, not because I had raised my voice or demanded explanations, but because the structure they had quietly built around my assumed cooperation was starting to shift, slowly, almost invisibly, like a foundation settling beneath a house. The consequences of the situation weren't explosive, they were subtle. Questions are appearing where certainty used to be. Small logistical problems are surfacing in places that once felt stable. And most importantly, a growing awareness that the person they believed had been silently adapting the entire time might not be adapting anymore. There is a strange quiet that settles after a long chapter of your life finally closes. Not the dramatic silence people expect after conflict, not the hollow emptiness that follows loss. Just space. For the first few weeks after Daniel moved out, the house felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed physically. The furniture was exactly where it had always been, the kitchen shelves still lined with the same dishes, but because the atmosphere was different, lighter. The mornings became something I noticed again. Before, mornings had been about preparation. Coffee for Daniel, breakfast for whoever happened to be staying with us. The quiet mental checklist of making sure everything ran smoothly before anyone else woke up. I had believed that was simply part of being a good partner. But now the mornings belonged to me. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I would sit by the large window in the living room with a cup of tea and watch the sunlight move slowly across the floor. It sounds like a small thing. Maybe it is. But when you've spent years organizing your life around other people's needs, small things begin to feel surprisingly meaningful. People often assume that when a marriage ends quietly, there must be bitterness hiding somewhere underneath. That resentment must linger like an echo. For a while, I waited to see if that would happen, but it didn't. What replaced it instead was clarity. I could finally see the pattern that had existed for years, one I had participated in without realizing it. Daniel hadn't forced me into invisibility. I had slowly accepted it, piece by piece, until it felt normal. That realization was uncomfortable at first, but it was also freeing, because if I had allowed that role to form, it meant I could choose a different one now. Work changed, too. I accepted a leadership position in a new consulting firm a few months later. It wasn't a dramatic career leap, just a natural step that I might have taken earlier if I had believed I was allowed to take up more space. The first time I led a full strategy meeting, I noticed something interesting. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed my suggestions. People listened carefully, asked questions, and built on my ideas. At the end of the meeting, one of my colleagues said something simple. "You're very calm under pressure." I almost laughed, because calm had never been my weakness. It had always been my strength. The difference now was that I understood it. Even my relationships with friends and family shifted in subtle ways. When people asked about the divorce, I didn't tell dramatic stories. I didn't assign blame. I simply explained that sometimes two people grow comfortable with a dynamic that quietly stops working. And sometimes the most respectful thing you can do, for both people, is acknowledge that truth. Daniel sent a message once, about a year later. It wasn't long. Just a short note saying he hoped I was doing well. I replied the same way. I wished him well, too. And I meant it. Because by then, the story had stopped being about what happened between us. It had become about something much simpler. Understanding who I was when I stopped trying to make myself smaller. These days, when people meet me for the first time, they often describe me the same way: quiet, composed, observant. And I don't mind that description anymore, because they're right. I am quiet, but quiet doesn't mean invisible. It means deliberate. And for the first time in a long while, the life I'm building feels exactly that way. Deliberate. If you had asked me years ago what quiet strength looked like, I probably would have given the wrong answer. I might have said it meant patience, or endurance, or the ability to keep a relationship peaceful no matter what. For a long time, I believed strength meant absorbing discomfort without making it visible. But life has a quiet way of correcting our definitions. The truth is, strength isn't always loud, but it also isn't silent surrender. Sometimes strength is simply awareness. The moment when you finally see a situation clearly. When you recognize the patterns that once felt normal but no longer feel healthy. When you realize that staying the same would require ignoring what you now understand. That moment rarely comes with fireworks. There's no dramatic confrontation, no explosive argument, no grand speech that changes everything overnight. For me, it arrived through small observations. A conversation that suddenly sounded different. A realization that I had been carrying more responsibility than partnership. A growing understanding that kindness and invisibility are not the same thing. And once that clarity arrives, something inside you shifts permanently. Not with anger, not with revenge, just with certainty. People often imagine that endings must come from conflict, that someone has to win and someone has to lose. But the ending of my marriage wasn't about defeating anyone. It was about recognizing that the life we had built together depended on a version of me that no longer existed. The woman who quietly adapted to everything. The woman who believed keeping peace meant asking for less. That version of me served a purpose once. She protected the relationship as best she knew how. But growth sometimes means thanking that earlier version of yourself and then letting her step aside. Today, my life is simpler. Not perfect. Not effortless. But honest. The people around me understand who I am now because I no longer hide the parts of myself that deserve space. And strangely enough, the calm that once made people underestimate me has become the very thing that guides my decisions. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes quiet simply that you're listening closely enough to know when it's time to change direction. Looking back, I don't regret the years I spent trying to make things work. They taught me patience. They taught me observation. But most importantly, they taught me how powerful clarity can be once you allow yourself to see it. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment in your life when you suddenly realized that a situation you once accepted no longer fit the person you had become? What helped you recognize it? I'd really like to hear your story.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.